Recording. All right, welcome to the React Native workshop from ACM Hack. You just joined the slides here, acmurl.com/react-native-slides. Checking code is React with the A, C, and T capitalized. So if you haven't checked in yet, go to members.acmucsd.com and check in, get your free points. If you want to follow along, just go to the link here and follow along with these slides. I'll just leave this up for a little bit in case people want to, or actually I'll just type the link in chat. Slides. Okay, so let's just get moving on. So don't forget to check in. Interesting thing about this slide, if you click this link here, this button here, this actually just checks you in automatically if you have an account and you're signed in. I haven't actually checked into my event yet, so I'm going to go do that right now. And there we go. We are checked in. I have to go back. Okay. Oh, this is a mistake. All right. So it's just a cool thing with this deck. So these slides are made with MDX deck. So this is using Markdown and React to make slides. If you want to navigate between them, just use the arrow keys or spacebar. Yeah, this is kind of a lot of work to make these slides, but I enjoy making these because I think you can make them look really good and have them be interactive. So these slides are not responsive. CSS is kind of hard, so I would say it's best to view them on a 16:9 screen. Just any desktop screen in general is going to work. So if you go on these on your phone, it's probably going to look really ugly. Anyway, let's just begin. So we're going to go with an introduction here. So what is React Native? So React Native is a framework for building mobile apps with React. So mobile apps are just native apps that run directly on your phone as opposed to the browser, right? So there's a difference between if you were to install the Twitter app from the Play Store or the App Store versus just going to twitter.com on Safari or Chrome, right? And if you don't know what React is, it's a JavaScript framework for building user interfaces. And as I said before, these slides are actually made partially using React. So yeah, that's just the basics of React Native and what it is. And there's a few reasons why this is good, right? Why do we want to use React to build mobile apps? So the current mobile landscape, in my opinion at least, is kind of not that great. So you have Android, if you want to develop for Android phones. I would say it's very difficult to get started. It requires very in-depth knowledge of Java and Kotlin. And in general, building user interfaces with Android is not super intuitive. So overall, it's just very annoying. Is the slide just one page? Oh, so use the left and right arrow keys to go between them, or the space bar. Anyway, so if you've taken CSE 110 with Griswold before, you might know, we had to build an Android app. It was very tedious and annoying, in my opinion, at least. I don't know. Some people may have enjoyed it. iOS is limited to Mac, unfortunately, which is expensive, right? You pretty much need a Mac to be able to develop for iOS on the iOS platform with Swift or Objective-C. And that's obviously a very high barrier of entry, right? Not everyone can afford a Mac. Not everyone has access to a Mac. So yeah. Next up is Flutter, this is kind of like the new kid on the block. It's a very promising new technology, but it's also very new. So it doesn't have the support that a lot of these older, much more developed platforms are. However, I really do like Flutter. If you're interested in learning more about Flutter, ACM Hack is actually planning to host a workshop series on Flutter development next quarter. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, and these are the reasons for React Native, is that we have reasons why not to use the other packages. but for reasons going for React Native, it's generally easier to grasp, especially for people coming from web development, right? Because you're just using React and JavaScript, these concepts that you might already be somewhat familiar with. So you have access to the amazingness of NPM. If you don't know what NPM is it's just a large ecosystem. It's a package registry of different JavaScript libraries and packages. So there's packages for like all sorts of things, right? And like if you need, chances are if you want some piece of code that you kind of use everywhere, NPM probably has it. And last thing is that it's cross-platform. So with React Native, you can write just one code base and compile for both iOS and Android. There's some caveats to this, right? There's different exceptions that you have to write different things for each platform, but in general, you can keep it such that one code base for both iOS and Android instead of developing two separate apps, which might be kind of annoying, right? Especially if you're just working on a personal project and you want your apps on both systems. You're basically writing two different projects at the same time. So I guess bigger companies can probably handle this, but individuals or smaller companies probably would prefer to go React Native. So we're going to be going over the basics of React because I know that not everyone might be familiar with React. And I would say React has a pretty, it's a decently steep learning curve for people that are not used to it. So we'll just be sort of breezing through the basics of React. We'll be going over JSX and components and how to write them, props and state, and then a brief intro to hooks. So starting with JSX and components. So these are the building blocks of React. So everything in React is a component, right? And what are components? Well, they allow you to reuse snippets of code without needing to copy paste. This is ideal if you have a bunch of very similar looking elements. So if you have, for example, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say on the ACM portal, right? You have a bunch of cards for different events. All these events are going to look, pretty similar, right? They all have a title, they all have a picture, they all have, a timestamp of when they happen. So it's rather than just copy pasting code over and over again to make each event card, right? We can just generate these automatically by just writing one piece of code and then just passing in the data we need. So as I mentioned before, in React, everything is component. So the app is basically one big component that contains many smaller components inside. And these components can be nested, right? So an app might contain multiple pages, and each page is a component. And then each page might contain different components within it. So this type of structure is essentially like the core of React, if you kind of think of it. Okay, so how do we write components? Well, components are written with a thing called JSX, which is basically an extension of JavaScript. So this stuff looks like HTML, but is just stuck in the middle of some JavaScript. It looks really weird if you're not used to it. And we'll go more in depth into what each line in this example means later. So right here, there's an example of a basic component, actually. So this component is called foo, just a random name, and it returns this HTML tag, apparently, which is really strange, right? If you've never seen stuff like this before, you can't just stick HTML in the middle of JavaScript. Or can you? Well, you actually can, right? This is what it is. So yeah. Let's move on then. So we'll begin with class-based components. And this is the old way of writing React components using classes. So JavaScript does have classes similar to Java or C++. And so if you're familiar with these object-oriented programming languages, you might be inclined to use class-based components for your app. So they're kind of tedious to write, and they're actually going to be deprecated eventually, I think. Deprecating just means like, losing support, because everyone's moving towards a different type of component. So we'll go over a very quick example as to like what a class component looks like. And it looks kind of like a Java class, right? You have some words that, you might have seen from Java if you've ever taken a Java class or Java. So the first line here declares that we will be writing React code. So you need this basically in order to be able to write anything in JSX. Otherwise, the compiler isn't really going to know what it's doing. Yeah, and React is kind of like a compiled language in that it just compiles down into vanilla JavaScript. So next up is, so this class example extends React component. So we're basically saying that example is a type of React.component. Yeah, class components, kind of gross. I'm just going over this because I feel like it's just needed for like context, because like a lot of React projects might still be using class components. And if you ever like Google stuff and look for things on Stack Overflow, some of the answers that are slightly older, like a few years older, might be using class components. So I feel like this is still relevant. So why are class components bad? Well, basically, it's not that they're bad. It's just that you can do a lot of the things with class components with much less code. Which we'll get into later. So this render method here, this determines what gets output. So it just simply returns the actual HTML that you want to display, and it'll render it. So next up, we go into functional components. So this is like going to why class components are bad. Functional components are essentially just much simpler. They require much less code. And you can actually take advantage of a lot of features of class components. Right? So they're the most basic form. They're simply a function that returns some JSX. So this is the same component written as a function. You notice how there's less code. It doesn't look like that much less because this is such a simple example. But like if we include lifecycle methods and other things, I'll get into what those are later. But if we include those things, you'll see it's going to be much, much simpler. Notice this is an example. So it's a function that takes no arguments and returns a div with stuff inside. This first line here is still needed. So even though we're not referencing React anywhere in this code, it's still needed to know that we're actually writing in JSX. Otherwise, everything's going to go wrong and it's going to not work. So yeah, why bother with this distinction? Well, in the old days, class components had access to additional features that functional components didn't have. So first of all, being lifecycle methods. So class components had a certain lifecycle. I don't remember what it is now because I haven't used them in so long. But you have functions like component did mount, component will unmount, component did unmount or stuff like that. And basically what these functions do is that when the component is rendered on the page or is re-rendered, and then after it gets de-rendered, when you switch off of it and it doesn't, need to be displayed anymore, you can run code to like do stuff with that. And then state to keep track of data, right? So if you have like a cookie clicker application, right, you want to keep track of how many times you've clicked the cookie. That would be kept track of in a state variable. However, recently, functional components have gotten these features via hooks, which is why class components are kind of being phased out, because you can do a lot of things with class components with functional components, and it's just much less code. So to stay consistent and to stay like up to date with modern React, we'll be using functional components from now on, just so we don't have to like switch between the different types or get confused. So yeah, it's not that class components are necessarily bad. It's just that functional components are just better. So we should just use those anyway. All right, so next up is props and state. So these are probably some of those powerful features of React. And to be able to understand this is like understanding 80% of React pretty much. So we'll start with props because these are arguably the easier of the two to understand. So this is short for properties. It allows you to pass specific attributes to a component. So in functional components, they're simply the arguments of a function. I say this isn't quite accurate because it's not really an argument. It's not really multiple arguments. It's one argument, and it contains different fields. So it's like a JSON object containing the different fields. Sometimes you might see people just pass in one argument, just called props, and then they might do props.title or props.date and props.text here. Either way works. I just prefer this way because you can clearly see what props a component needs and can accept. And I guess if you want to be super precise about this, you can use TypeScript, which I did a workshop on last week actually, to define exactly what props go in and what type the props should be. But for now, we're just sticking with JavaScript. I think this is like a happy medium. And you can sort of reference the data in the HTML itself. This is kind of like a template, I guess. So whatever title is it's going to get displayed in H1. And title doesn't have to be a prop. These don't have to be props. If you declare them as variables within the function, then they will also get displayed. So next up is state, and this keeps track of specific data that you can change at any time. And using the useState hook, you can literally use state in functional components. There's a different way of doing this with class-based components, but that's not really needed because this is just much simpler. So how you use this hook is that it takes in a value as an argument, and this is the default value of the variable. And it returns a tuple containing the state variable and a function to change it. So in this example, if we have a cookie clicker application, for example, notice how we import the useState, then we call it here. So we declare a variable called clicks, and it's the default value is 0. That's how I like to read it. So you declare a state variable called clicks with a default value of 0. And whenever you want to change this value, you can just call setClicks and pass in the new value you want to change. Yeah, I'll get more into what hooks are later. Basically, they just let you hook into features of React. That's where they got their name. So intro to hooks, as I said before, you can hook into features of React. So this is a relatively new feature of React. It allows you to use certain features of React that were previously unavailable in functional components. So useState is an example of a hook, and you can even write your own hooks. So I should have probably given a better example for this, but let's say you have a function that keeps track of your location, right? Rather than having to go to your location API or whatever and get that data every time, what if you just wrote your own hook called useLocation? Yeah, it's like a function template for data or whatever that can change. Is the JS code for the slides themselves available to parse? Yes. Let me actually send you the GitHub link. See if I have it actually. I think repositories. Yeah, so this is the actual slides, if anyone wants to look at this. All right. So back to this. So this is a relatively new feature of React, so you can write your own hooks. So there's certain rules for hooks essentially. I'm not going to get into like too in depth as to what hooks are because frankly you don't need that deep of an understanding of hooks in general to be able to use some of them. But I would say the main hook to understand is useEffect. At its core, useEffect controls what happens when your component is rendered or de-rendered. That's just the base, like most basic way I could describe it. It can do much more, right? So previously, you can only do this with class components and their lifecycle methods. So here's a really basic example of effect hook, right? So if you just call it like this, whenever the component is rendered, so every time it's rendered, it's going to call whatever code is in here. So this is a function, and it returns another function. And this function here gets called when the component is de-rendered. So it might be a little weird to see like functions that return functions that get passed into a function. Like that just sounds crazy when I say it, but you'll get used to the syntax, and it's just very useful for doing like different things. So you can also use it to update things or run code when a dependency is changed. And dependencies are passed in as an array. So for example, here, let's say dependency is a state variable, right? Whenever the state changes, let's say you want to do something like whenever you click on a cookie, right? You want to, I don't know, send that data to a server or something to say that you clicked it, right? That's not a very good example, but like, let's say we're doing that. Well, dependency would be, the variable, right? Clicks, and then the do something here would be like sending data to a server. So yeah, that's just the basics of it. And you can specify an empty array. And this is a function that returns, that runs only on the first render of a component. So in the previous example, this would run every time a component is re-rendered. So if you have stuff here, it might run like over and over again as data keeps changing. But if you don't want to do that, then you can just run it once if you have this empty array here. This isn't super crucial, I would say. It's just a good like first step into hooks. It's the simplest hook to understand. Yeah. For the purposes of this workshop, we're not going to be really using other hooks or writing our own. So this is just pretty much all you need. But if you do want to read more, be sure to check out the React website and the React documentation. They go a lot more in depth as to like what the rules of hooks are and all that. All right, so now for the fun part, we sort of live coding, building a simple but very ugly note-taking app. Yeah, if you want to follow along, feel free to just like stop me or anything if I'm going too fast, and you can obviously skip ahead if I'm going too slow. So here's a quick demo of what we're going to be building. So yeah, this is the app here. It looks very ugly. I apologize. I didn't want to put too much effort into the CSS. But this is essentially a note-taking app. Thank you. I needed that. This is a not very good CSS, but that's okay. So if you want to create a new note, oh no, what happened? I swear this was working before. Okay, let's do some live debugging. I swear I tested this right before the workshop and it was working. Oh no, this is the what is it? It's just the iOS simulator from macOS. I just have it like tiled in a full screen window to make it look nice. Okay, edit note. I'll explain what some of this stuff is later. Params.title. Are you serious? Oh, right. I forgot. Okay, I'll explain what this is later. Okay. Well, let's try this again. All right, this works. So if we want to create a new note, let's say like, I don't know, CSC 140L, this class is painful, right? So we want to remember how painful it was. So let's just click save. And now we have this note here, right? So this displays every note that we have in the database. It's not really a database, it's like a mock database, but for our purposes, it's a database. Anyway, if you want to edit the note, you can do that by clicking edit note. And like, let's say, you want to increase the pain of this class because you found it's getting worse, then let's just add another sentence. Okay. And you hit save, it'll save the data and it'll display it. I don't have a way of deleting notes because I was too lazy to make that, but theoretically you could make a button to delete each note as you're done with it. And also if you write something that you don't want saved, you can just hit back and it's not going to save it. So for this is just a very basic, I guess we'd call this a CRUD app, standing for create, read, update, delete, I believe, except there's no deleting in this one. So this is pretty simple. Before we begin, so this is only if you want to follow along locally. I'll like have the code up and everything, for you to just watch if you aren't into like installing things on your computer that you don't even know you'll be using. But yeah, I highly recommend just downloading Node.js and NPM in general, because if you're doing anything with JavaScript, it's just going to be super helpful. Just click this link here. Don't also install Expo with this command here, npm install -g expo. The -g just means you're installing it globally for everyone to use, or not like everything on your computer to use, not just the current project. And if you want, you can have an Android or iOS device or emulator handy. And if you do have like a physical device, then be sure to download the Expo app. It's very cool how you could just test things directly on your device. So the starter code is right here. It's pretty much a mostly set up project with some pieces missing that we're going to fill in. So if I copy link address, I'll paste this in the chat if you're not on the slides. Yeah, feel free to just clone the repo, follow along. I'll leave this up for a little bit in case people are just getting set up here.
For us non-code inclined people, does npm install -g expo go into the terminal?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have said that. But yeah, it does go into the terminal. Any command just goes into the terminal. All right, I'll just move on for now because I'm going to be talking about React Native components. So React Native uses a slightly different set of components than React. So rather than doing web-based components like divs or P for paragraph or like H1 or whatever, React Native uses its own native mobile-based components. So these components directly translate to various iOS and Android components. So they look like they're part of iOS or part of Android. So here's a very simple chart. There's obviously more than 4 components, but this is just the ones that you would use the most. So a view corresponds to a div. A div is just the most generic component in web. So it's just anything that contains anything. Scroll view is just a div that scrolls. Web doesn't make a distinction with this, but React Native does. Text corresponds to P, but really depending on your styling, right, you can have different text elements be whatever. So text really corresponds to any type of text that you want in your application. And then text input is just corresponding to input. So this is if you have fields, like for example, in this app, right, where you want to type stuff in, this is a text input. So yeah. And in terms of Expo, so what we installed there, npm install-g expo, this provides a framework for running and developing React Native apps. So there's no need to install like gigabytes and gigabytes of SDKs for Android and iOS. So running your app, so let's just try running the starter code actually. SDK means software development kit. So let's try running our app. So I'm going to go to the starter code here. This is the finished code. Git checkout master. Yes, I know how to do. Oh, sorry about this. Git is a version control system for those of you who don't know. So it's like Google Drive for code, right? You keep track of different versions and different branches of your code. Git master. So like right there, I have a branch that's solution, so it contains all the solution code. And then this master is just the same code base, but with stuff removed, basically. So anyway, let's run yarn start. So if you don't have yarn installed, you could run npm start as well. They pretty much do the same thing. But yarn is generally a more preferred way of doing things. I don't know what just happened. Okay. So if you want to install yarn, it's npm-g install-g yarn. I think it just runs a little faster when installing things, but there's not really much of a difference. So when you run this, you should see a browser window pop up. And this is basically the Metro Expo console. Yeah, so basically you have these buttons here, run an iOS simulator, run an Android device / emulator. So if you have an iOS simulator like I do, then you can simply click this button. I think I have to close this first. So if I just click this, it's gonna try to open it on the iPhone here. And so this is the base starter code app, and this is what it looks like. If you don't have a simulator handy, then you can use your phone. So you go into the Expo app. Let's see, it's taking a while to load. Then scan QR code, and simply just point your camera, at the QR code. And oh, it didn't seem to work here. So if it doesn't seem to work, then use Tunnel. Can you run it under web browser? Yes. So you can just click run in web browser. No guarantees that everything will look like perfectly clean. Okay, let me. Yeah, there we go. So this is the web browser. If you want to see what it would look like on your phone, then you'd click inspect element or inspect, and then just click this little button here. And then just pick like a device. Web browser isn't super ideal for this because I guess things might get distorted or stretched or whatever, because they're not quite the same components. So yeah, hopefully everyone is somewhat familiar with Expo now. So if you couldn't get it to work on your phone, then you could, as a last resort, use web browser. Yeah, so these are just the basic instructions. Scanning the QR code if you're doing this on a physical phone. So now let's talk about the actual project structure. So the project structure itself contains screens, the folder here, and this contains a layout or a screen of the app. For this app, we only have two screens, home and edit note. Components here contains isolated components that we write. So in this case, note is a component. So if we go, if you remember the old app, then it had different notes, right, that were displayed. Each note is its own component. And that's the example I got with like code reuse, right? You're reusing that component over and over again instead of having to copy paste that code. So anyway, app.js is our top level container that wraps everything together. So this will become relevant later as to why we need to differ between app and home. Storage.js, you don't need to really worry about this. This is just a mock database that I wrote for demo purposes. So if you were writing an actual app, you would use like an actual database for this, like MongoDB or Firebase. If you don't know what those are, that's fine. You don't need to know that for this workshop. So let's take a look at home.js, or home screen first. So I got this really cool like code view on these slides with some cool animations. So you see all this stuff. You're like, whoa, what is all this? Like, I've never seen all this before. Well, I'll tell you what this means. So first of all, this home is a component, right? It's a functional component. And it returns, all this stuff. So everything is wrapped in a safe area view. And this stuff essentially keeps the contents inside of the screen. So you know how your phone has like, the notification bar on top and, different things on the side, right? Like if you want to keep all your content within that area, you don't want it to bleed out the sides of the screen, then this is what you would use. So scroll view, we've seen this before. This just says that, okay, we can scroll this component. And then the stuff inside here, I should have explained, but it's essentially just a view containing text. Okay, and then instead of CSS, this is how we style components in React Native. So if you've done regular React before, or any web development in general, you might be familiar with CSS. And that's basically specifying certain visual attributes of divs or components. So in React, you would do the same thing, except it would be in an actual CSS file. So in React Native, we do something very similar. We define different visual attributes for different containers and divs, but in this slightly different format using JavaScript objects instead. So you don't really have to worry about any of the CSS here. I personally hate doing CSS, so I don't want to teach it. I don't really want to like deal with it. So I just kind of wrote the bare minimum. All of it should already be there for you. I don't want to have to explain it because frankly, I don't think I'm really qualified to explain it. Yeah, I'm just not very good at CSS and I don't really like it that much. So in the code, all the CSS should already be written for you. Or I guess all the styling. This technically isn't CSS. All right, so next up, let's write our first component, note.js. So real quick, see note.js. I should probably have the solution code on the side. That would be a good idea. Sorry, it's been a long day. I'm tired. Give me a sec. Okay, so within Node.js, this is the sort of component that we're looking at. We're going to add stuff in here. So we already have properties passed in. So title, content, and onClick. Title and content are pretty obvious, right? Title of the note and then the actual body of the note. OnClick, we'll get into what this means later. For now, let's start filling this in. So, oops. So if you notice, I'm going to sort of make this thing look a little better. So inside of a note, right, there's the title. So let's just start with that. So this text here gets displayed as a title, right? Because that kind of makes sense. And then if we want to style this, so we want to make the title slightly bigger. So I wrote a style here called H1. So we can just pass that in as the styles. And then similarly, we can display the content as text as well. So we're going to write text here, content. So this is just displaying the content. We're not specifying any additional styling on this. Let's say you wanted to use like a different font or something. You could write your own style here, like call it content or something, and then write your style here. For this workshop, we don't really need to do that. But you can see how styles get passed in through here, through this styles object. Next up, we'll be using a button. Oh, by the way, whenever you use components like this, you have to import them from React Native. So anyway, let's do a button. So this is just as the name suggests, is a button, right? You click it and it does stuff. The way we specify the text of it is through a prop called title. And title, we'll just say this is edit note, right? And then on press, so the prop is called on press. I called this on click. I probably should have called it on press just to be consistent. But yeah, so we're just passing in the function directly like that. And basically, and this is a closing tag here just to, so we don't have anything inside the button, right, that we need to specify. So this just closes it off. And we don't need to add like another button. You could theoretically do this, or oops. You could theoretically do that. But it's just kind of a waste of space when you could just do that. And you notice whenever you save, Expo should auto update. It's just not showing here because we don't have notes at all, right? If we look in home, there's no note component. It's just this text. So that's why nothing is being displayed. So hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, let's get into next part. So this is just showing off the solution. I really like these animations here, so that's why I wanted to include this. So adding a title component, displaying the title prop. And we're passing in the style here that we previously defined. Then we have another text component to display the content. And then finally, a button for editing the note. Oops. So on click here, this is a function that will get passed in later. So on click is currently not defined. It'll be defined in a different component and passed in as a prop, if that makes sense. So we can specify the behavior of what happens when we click from outside of the component. Alrighty, so what did we just do? So again, note is a component with 3 props: title, content, and onClick. So title and content are strings displayed as text components, and onClick is a function that is passed in later. So button is a new component, and we were passing the previous onClick function as a prop. So this is an example of actually using the note component. So if you wanted to use this component in your code, right, then you would pass in something like this. Looks like I really don't like CSE 140L. So yeah, if you wanted to specify it like this, right, title, content, onClick. Some function, this is just going to be any function that you define. So if you've been following along, then congrats. You just wrote your first React Native component. Let's just stop and make sure that everything works as intended. So what we can do is, just as a quick sanity check, let's just add a few node components onto the home screen, right? So that's here, home.js. Let's just stick them in here. So notice how we import note from the actual directory. So dot dot just means going up a level, and then we're going into components and then into the note.js file. The .js is not required. You can type it out if you want. But for JavaScript, importing stuff like this is not required. Anyway, so note here, then we pass in the title. It could just be whatever. And then the content. It's just some random Latin. And then finally, onClick. For now, let's just specify an empty function. Let's save. So you notice this gets displayed, right? This is what we want. So now, if I wanted 10 of these, right, I could just paste this over and over again, and it'll show 10 of these, which is very cool. And if we change any of the text here, right, let's say this is, I don't know, I'm hungry, I want tacos. Tacos are delicious. If we include any of that, then the data here will change to reflect that. Right now, these buttons don't do anything because the function here doesn't do anything. These are just empty functions. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. All right, now we're moving on. Let's fill out editNote.js. So editNote.js is another screen here. So let's just try to fill that out. So right in here. So you notice this navigation prop. We'll get into what this means later. For now, just kind of ignore it. And I'm just going to move some things around to make it more appealing. Okay, so now we can start typing stuff. So for this, we want to use state actually to keep track of this. We're going to specify 2 state variables. Because remember in the edit note screen, we had 2 inputs, right? So we're going to specify a title. And this is going to be useState. We'll keep it as an empty string for now. And then content. And we'll also keep this as an empty string. So this is just specifying the default values for everything. So next up, we're going to do a text input component. And the style would just be, this would be a title. So this will be the title. Styles that title. And then value is going to be title, right? We want it to start with nothing in it. And by default, title has nothing in it. And then there's a different prop called onChangeText. And this is what gets called whenever the text changes. And this is a function. So this prop takes in a function with one argument. And that argument is the text that got changed, right? It's the new text that you entered. What do we want to do with this? Well, we just want to set the title of the text. So this is just an example of like how state hooks get used, right? You include the text, you pass in the new text into this function here, which sets it. And you notice also in the app, right, there was a placeholder. So that gets passed in as a prop called placeholder. And we'll say this is note title. Let me just make this a little more easier to read. So styling your code is a useful skill, right? We write code for other humans, not just for computers. Anyway. And technically, if you want to, you can just pass in, set title. Because set title takes in one argument, and this function also takes in one argument. This might be kind of confusing, so we'll just go back to this. So next up, we'll be doing the same thing with our other component. So this is for the content. So we don't want any special styling on this, so we'll get rid of that. Value will be content instead. And the placeholder, let's just say note content. And this is the same function here, except instead of set title, we're doing set content. Right, simple enough. Then we'll add a button to save the data and go back. So it's a button, title equals, let's say save. And using this onPress prop again, we'll define what it's going to do when we press it. Let's save data. Title. So this save data function, don't really worry about this too much. This is in that storage.js file that I mentioned. And it simply is just a mock database that we're saving this to. We're saving the title as the key and then content as the value. So it's like a key value pair. So whenever we want to get the content of this note, we can just get the title of it and then pass that in to read from the database, and it'll give us the content. That's the gist of it. And we'll close off this tag here. So just to review, this navigation prop, not important for now. We'll get into it later. We'll add some state variables to keep track of the text fields. These are the two main fields, so the text input components. Notice, I forgot to add multi-line here. So multi-line just means that this content can span multiple lines. And it's still a prop, but it's true false. So including it just basically means we're setting it to true. And lastly, the button here. All right, so next step here, this is navigation. So navigating between screens is a little bit different from regular React and web development. So, in web development, right, everything works with links. So we have, like, for example, here, right, this is a link, right? You click the link, it takes you to a different page. That makes sense, right? It could be a different page on a different website. It could be a different page on the same website. But in React Native, it's handled a little bit differently because of just how apps work on your phone. So we'll be using the React navigation library. If you click here, you can read more about it. But its most basic form is the stack navigator. And the stack navigator is basically each screen is pushed to the stack as you navigate. So let's say you have a screen 1 here, and then when you go to the next screen, it gets essentially pushed to the top in a stack. And then you want to go back, it just pops it from the stack and gets you back to the first screen. So for our app, we only have 2 screens, right? Home and edit note. Oh, and this last point here, as a best practice, navigation should be handled at the screen level instead of components. So you noticed how our note application, or our note component, our note component didn't have any navigation code at all, right? Because we don't need to. We should handle that on the actual home screen rather than, inside of the component. So let's just modify app.js to support navigation. So it's very interesting how we handle this. Just go in here. So we have to define a stack navigator. So that's what this function is for. Again, normally you have to install and import this, but I already have it done for you, so it's just easier. So we're going to say, okay, stack is equal to create stack navigator. And it doesn't take in any arguments. And next up here, we actually have to remove that. Everything goes in what's called a navigation container. And then within that container, that's where we actually define our stack navigator. So stack.navigator. And then within this navigator, we can actually define what screens go where. So stack.screen, I believe, yeah. Name is equal to, so we have our home screen, component equals home. Remember that everything is a component in React, so home itself, even though it's a screen, it's also just a big component. And that's imported from here. We're going to do the same with the edit note screen. Edit note. This is where we specify, not quite. So this is just defining what screens are in the actual application. That gets defined later on in home.js. So this is sort of like it's kind of like the highway system, I guess, that we know where things are going. And there's a prop here that we can specify called initial route or route name. And we want the initial route to be home, right? Because it's the first screen we want to display. So let's save. Yeah, you notice nothing much really changed, right? Because we're still displaying home as the screen. So here's just a recap of that. Create stack navigator, put everything inside a navigation container. Then we have the screen names and their corresponding components right here. So now here's the part where we actually get to navigating between the screens, right? We've defined the different possible screens, but we haven't actually defined how to go between them. So next up is in our home.js file. So in home.js, let's add a new button here. Right, this is that create note button that we saw before. So button title equals create note. On press equals function. Let's close off this tag. So on press, what happens here? Well, if we saw an edit note, this is where the navigation prop comes into play. So if we define a screen in the stack navigator, we get access to this navigation prop. Excuse me. And this is what allows us to go between screens. So it's navigation.navigate. And we just navigate, we just pass in the root here. So this is, you can think of this kind of like a link, right? You're clicking a link to go to a different page in your website if you're used to web development or anything like that. And theoretically, this can be anything you want, right? If you just wanted to like call it something different other than the name, then that's where you do it here. And you just need to keep it consistent between the different components. If I save here, you notice we have this new create note button, and we can click it and we can go to this new screen. So that's just the very basics. All right, we add the navigation prop, then we create a button that takes us to the edit note component. So now back to edit note.js. So that save button that we never really finished, right? It saves it, but it doesn't really take us back. So if we were to like click here and then click save, we have to click save and then go back, right? That's not very intuitive for the user, right? If you save something, you expect to kind of just close it, at least in this app, this really simple app. So let's just add an extra line of code here in this function. We'll say navigation, and navigation has a bunch of different things attached to it. One of the possible things is go back. So this literally like is what it says. It goes back. All right, so now if we type stuff, we hit save, it's going to go back. And here is just adding in the go back function. And this is essentially what pops the screen from the stack, right? You have your home screen, and then you have your edit note screen. And then when you go back, that just takes that off, takes the layer off, and you're back on the home screen. Oh, right. I forgot to go into this. So let's say you also want to pass data into the, will back always take you to the home page? No, actually. So if you have like 4 screens, for example, it'll take you back to whatever the last screen was, right? Think of it like a stack of books, right? If you remove the top book, you're going to get whatever book happens to be under it, not necessarily the bottom book. There is a way of getting you like directly to the screen you want, and that's called deep linking. We'll get into that later. Navigation is a global built-in variable. No, so navigation is actually a prop that gets passed into the function. And that happens behind the scenes in this code here. And there's actually a different way of doing navigation if you're interested. This is another example of a hook. So instead of navigation in the prop, you might do something like navigation equals use navigation. And that would just get passed, that would pretty much do the same thing. This is useful if you want to do navigation in components. So let's say for whatever reason, right, you're like 4 layers deep into like a component or something, and you don't want to keep passing in this navigation prop around, then you could just use this hook here, use navigation, to get access to it directly. But for this purpose, we don't really need that hook. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? All right, cool. So here I didn't go over this because I forgot this was part of it. I thought it was a different slide. But let's say you want to pass in special data, right? Because if we want to click edit note on this tacos note, we don't want a blank canvas, right? We want to edit whatever note we currently have, so we don't have to start over every time. So let's just do that here. So within the props, you can specify, route. So route is just another prop that gets handled again with behind the scenes here. You don't need to worry about how it does that. And to get access to the parameters, it's route.params. And you saw that there's a weird bug where sometimes if you don't pass in parameters is null, right? So we add a question mark. Just this is like a null check. It's a relatively new feature of JavaScript where if params doesn't exist for whatever reason, it's just not going to matter. And the title is the name of the param. Params could pretty much be any object, so you can have any number of fields here. It doesn't have anything to do with your state variables. So think of these like another way of defining props, but for navigation and screens. And then we'll do this interesting syntax here, which is the double question mark. And this is another feature of JavaScript that's kind of new. Basically, it's saying that if whatever stuff exists here, if it's not a null value, so because sometimes, right, in this example, we're not passing in any props into the router, right? We're just passing in a blank object technically. So this stuff will be null. So if this is null, then we use this value. Otherwise, if it's not null, then we use this value. It's a shorthand. There's like a different way of doing this. I think the old way is something like this, or route params. Title, and then like a colon here. This is a ternary statement. You don't need to worry about this. But this is just like a shorthand way of doing that. So we're going to do the same thing here. Params. Don't forget the question mark, otherwise you get really dumb bugs. So this passes in the parameters and assigns them to the state only if we actually pass in parameters. Otherwise, we just start as an empty string. That's what this means. So let's get back to this. So yeah, route.params allows, this is what allows us to pass data between screens. Okay, so final steps will be displaying all the notes in the home screen. This is arguably the toughest part. I felt like I should have, I couldn't really find a better way of teaching this step. It's kind of like the rest of the owl type of deal. If you're familiar with that meme. So let's just go through this step by step rather than just writing it all at once. So we're going to start here, right, with a state variable to keep track of notes. So I'm just going to copy this code here because that's like 90% of software development anyway. Notes, set notes equals use state. And notes is going to be an array of notes. So we'll start it off to be an empty array. Then we'll use the useEffect hook and it's going to do stuff in here. And instead of all these notes, we can just pass in notes. So if we save, we're going to have nothing because notes is an empty array. So let's just get all data from the mockDB. Like normally you'd use an actual call to an API or database for this step, but this is just for demo purposes. So real quick, I'll get into async functions. So all these are asynchronous functions technically, which means that if you call this code here and then you like do something else here, let's say you did something like let data equal get all data, right? If you want to do something with data here, it's not going to be updated because you can think of this running as a separate process in a separate thread. So it's going to call this line of code and then instantly start running whatever is in here. It doesn't wait for this to finish, essentially. So how we can get around that, we can use async and await, but you can't really do that in useEffect. So we're just going to use a regular promise in JavaScript, just dot then. And this just takes in a function with the data that gets returned. So now whatever code we write in here is going to be, it is going to get run after this call gets finished. But if we write stuff out here, it's not going to necessarily wait. Then do something with the data. So this next step is going to be like crazy. Yeah, the rest of the freaking owl. So this is kind of a lot. So we'll just explain this line by line and then we'll write it in. So set notes, right? We're setting the notes. We're updating this array. Then we're doing essentially mapping each note. So note is, or data.map. So data is the data that we just got. And map just maps it to a new array. So then in the map function, this is what gets called on each element of data. And for each element of data, we're going to create a note. So this is part of JSX, right? We're returning a component. We're returning a note component. And we're passing in the props of note 0 and note 1. So each note here in the array is its own array. It's essentially two elements. The first element being the title, the second element being the content. This might change depending on how your database is implemented. But for our purposes, this is what it is. So we're setting the title, we're setting the content. Then here in the onClick function, this is where it gets interesting, right? We're navigating to edit note, but as the second argument, we're passing in the title and the content as whatever data we got here. So what this allows us to do is basically, edit the current note that we click on. So I'm just going to copy this code because I frankly don't want to write all this. So let's just copy, paste, like the good software engineers we are. And now you notice, as soon as we pasted it in, guess what? Everything updated. So this just happens to be every note that was already in the database. You might not have the same notes, right? If you created different notes before in the demo app, you might not have any notes. So you can start creating notes to fill it in. So like, what just happened, right? We added a bunch of things. So each note in the database is an array. So think of it like an array of arrays, right? You have, if I can just type it in real quick, you have an array here, and each array is like title, content. And then you have another thing, like another. So this is the structure of our data. I'll just remove that. For each of these nodes, we programmatically generated a node component. So this is where React came in handy, right? Instead of like writing, components for each of these, we can actually generate this automatically from this function. And that's what this data.map is. It maps each element in data to a node component. And then the next thing is that in the on-click of each note, we handle the navigation. Title and content are passed as the route parameters in this object here. Or more accurately, this object. Right, so this is what I mean by handling navigation on the component level. We could theoretically, or not the component level, the screen level. We could theoretically, handle it here, right? Define an on-click here, and use navigation, use that hook that I talked about earlier, and then just pass in the title and content. But that's generally not really good practice. I generally recommend doing things at the screen level so that we're going between screen to screen and not like component to screen or anything like that. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the app actually. So a final demo, let's just run everything to make sure everything works. So if you don't have Expo already running, I'll just stop it real quick. Again, you just do yarn start or npm start, either one works. It's going to open the web browser. We are just going to close this real quick. Run an iOS simulator. You can also run it on your phone by scanning the QR code here. So we just clicked it. It's going to install everything. Ignore these errors. This is just like a minor thing that doesn't really matter. The app still works, and that's what matters. So now if we click edit note, right, we have all of the data filled in. That's what this did, right? And we can change this however we like. And hit save and it'll save. Or maybe not. Oh no, that was this note. Create a new note. Again, we get to say new note. And it'll show up here. And notice how it's a scroll view, right? So if things start to overflow, then it'll scroll down. Can we get the solution code? Yes. So if we go into the GitHub repo real quick. Okay, bring this over. Close that. Okay. If we go here, if you click this button here, there's two branches to this, master and solution. Solution here contains the solution code. There is a bug in the solution code, as we saw before, and that was in the edit note. I forgot some question marks after params. But yeah, what exactly is your bug though? I might be able to help. Cannot read title of undefined. Type error. It's happening in edit note. So I would assume this question mark is, did you forget this question mark? Because if params is not defined, right, it's going to try to read params and then fail, and then it's going to try to read title, but params doesn't exist. So does this question mark just happen to fix it? Okay, good to know. It can also be like style sometimes. Sometimes I forget the S here because like it's confusing, right? Style is the prop and then styles is the object. So like I forget the S sometimes. That also happens. Um, in terms of bugs, like if you see a bug pop up, then just like read the error message. Try to find where the actual line of the like file that it's happening in. Anyway, where are the slides? Okay, there it is. So if you have more interest in learning more about this topic, here's some additional resources. So the React.js docs, I'm gonna stop full screening here. The React.js docs, this is where you can brush up on React fundamentals. So the docs here are very, very helpful. For example, you have just hello world, right? The very basics. What is JSX, components and props, state, lifecycle, everything. Some more advanced concepts like this. Yeah, in general, just any tutorials you recommend on connecting the app to a database. So there's actually a YouTube channel that I actually like called fireship.io. They also have a website. There's different tutorials on using Firebase, I believe, to connect your app to a database. Yeah. If you also are interested in full stack development, so the backend stuff for this, so last quarter, ACM Hack did a program called Hack School, where we had like a full stack web development course. So we covered MongoDB, which is the database, Node.js, which is and Express, which is the server side tech, and then React to actually develop the front end. So it's on our YouTube channel, acmurl.com/YouTube. Yeah. And anyway, you also have React Native docs here. So this is for mobile specific development. So this is where I've started learning, actually. I was just reading through this. And they have pretty nice interactive demos as well that you can try. So this is also a really great resource for learning. And lastly, React Navigation. This was the library I used to go between screens. So there's way more concepts, right? I only covered like pretty much one of these. But things like life cycle, navigating with tabs, navigating with drawers like this, right? Deep linking, which I briefly mentioned. If you want to know how to do all of that, then this is the resource for you. So with that, that pretty much concludes this workshop. So thank you everyone for coming. Looks like we got 6 people to stay till the end. So thank you very much. It's been a fun experience making these slides and just teaching in general. I'm going to end it off here with some lo-fi music. Do you know when the recording will be uploaded? Hopefully in the next few days. Yeah. Where is our, okay. Yeah, thank you for coming. Yeah, looking forward to mobile dev workshops next quarter. They're coming.